On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, a look at the federal workforce on the other side of the fork in the road. Canceled contracts and do not pay lists, the landscape for contractors gets cloudy. And a warning for the IRS as tax season opens. Welcome to Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. Voluntary early retirement authorities coming to every agency in government. Agencies have several tools now to resize their workforces. Jeff Neal is the host of the Chief HRO blog. He's former Chief Human Capital Officer at the Department of Homeland Security. Sydney Heimbrock is Chief Industry Advisor for Public Sector at Qualtrics. She's former Executive Director of the Innovation Lab at the Office of Personnel Management. Friends, welcome. It's great to have both of you on the program. Sydney, I start with you. There is a lot going on in the minds of members of the workforce and members of the HR community in government. What would you advise them to think about now as they try to sort out all the loose parts that are flying around?
So I would advise everyone to take a deep breath. For HR, I think the imperative is communication. I think, there's a lot of misinformation, confusion, anxiety for very good reason. And one of the things that HR could really help with is just be really clear on what are the current mechanisms, how do they work step by step, and how can employees essentially exercise their choices, right, as professionals in government with professional skills and decide what they want to do next.
Jeff, you wrote about the voluntary resignation is the term that the administration used on your blog recently. What was the gist of the message you want to convey to folks about what their choices are?
Well, the message is, first of all, that people need to make a decision based on what's best for them and their families, and make a decision that's as informed as it can be. The problem is that we don't know exactly what some of the things are going to be. The courts are still putting this whole thing on hold. We don't know if there is going to be any kind of action in Congress to stop anything. I doubt it. I don't think there will be. But people need to make a decision based on what's best for them, based on what information they've got available to them. They do need to understand, though, that if they put in a resignation email, as they've been asked to do, that is basically irrevocable. Once you've said, I quit, an agency doesn't have to honor it if you come back and say, well, I've had second thoughts, I don't want to quit. Mm-hmm. So people who decide that they want to take it need to understand that they're going to be gone in all likelihood.
What are the tools that HR professionals should leverage in your view right now, Jeff, along the lines of what Sydney talked about, to try to keep some sense of order and some sense of engagement among their workforces? Well,
the first thing is to do what the Department of Veterans Affairs has done. VA has exempted over 300,000 of their positions from this voluntary resignation and early retirement offer. And they've done that because they have a vital mission. They're providing health care and providing benefits to America's veterans, and they need professionals to do that. They have a hard enough time finding doctors and nurses and other medical professionals. If you pay those people to go away or to not work for 6 or 7 months, you run the risk of breaking the agency, and it's a vital agency that this country relies on. So every agency needs to be looking at what positions they need to exempt based on their mission, and the administration is letting them do that. So they need to absolutely make certain that they are not offering this resignation or retirement offer to people that they can't afford to lose. And they also need to keep in mind that when you start offering things like that, and this is a very blunt instrument, when you start offering things like this, the people who are most likely to take it are the people who are the very best employees you have, the ones who have marketable skills, who have a lot of initiative, who have a lot of confidence in themselves. Those are the people you're most likely to lose. So you're probably going to lose the best people and keep the worst. That's not the approach most of us in HR, I think Sydney would agree, would take. We actually would prefer to get rid of the worst and keep the best. This may have the opposite result, and that can be a bad thing.
You're nodding your head in agreement with Jeff as he's speaking there.
Yeah, and I want to go back to a word you used, Francis, which is engagement. And it sounds like almost laughable. Like, how could we possibly be thinking about engagement? It's really the frontline managers that I worry about, because at the same time that they themselves are employees affected by all of this, they have to manage their teams. And so I would encourage frontline managers, executives, supervisors, to take a look at some tried and true methods. I now work with Qualtrics. We work with most of the Fortune 500 companies who realize if you want to make a profit, if you want to grow, you have to pay attention to what's going on with your people. And that's really about manager effectiveness, creating open lines of communication with your employees, creating an environment of psychological safety. Again, sounds counterintuitive, but within a team, what a manager controls, you can do that. And you can then help your employees feel more confident about the choices that they can make.
Sydney, Jeff talked about the exemptions that VA has done and the ability of other agencies to do that.
Yeah.
How does one look at one's workforce and resist the temptation to say, well, they should all be exempt because they're all important to the mission, when I imagine that's something that a lot of people inside each agency think?
Right. So it's important to distinguish between every human being is important, and in an organization, there are some critical occupations that if you don't have skilled people in those seats, you might as well just go home, right? That's the kind of strategic decision making that, I helped OPM stand up the Strategic Workforce Planning Center that's now in existence. And that was what we were trying to do, is help agencies use data, be predictive, understand what is the service requirement that's coming at us in the future, and put the right people in place to deliver those services for the American people.
I'm going to put you back at DHS in your Chico seat there. What are you thinking about this week for what the workforce has to look like 6 months from now or a year from now, when theoretically at least this current hubbub is in the rearview mirror?
Well, first of all, you have to look at what types of positions you could afford to lose. If you go to Customs and Border Protection, they can't afford to lose Border Patrol agents. They're hard enough to find and train. You can't afford to lose the CBP officers. You can't afford at Transportation Security Administration to lose your TSOs or your air marshals. So really in a department like DHS, you're really left with the headquarters and your overhead jobs. And that's where you could probably start making cuts. You can make cuts in HR, you can make cuts in budgeting or contracting. You may find if you don't do that very well that you have trouble filling jobs or awarding contracts, but you can start making your cuts in overhead. But when you look at the mission roles, there are very few pure mission roles at DHS where I would want to pay people to go away right now, knowing how hard it is to fill those jobs and how long it takes to train them. If you want to train a Secret Service agent, it takes a long time. So you have to be very careful about how you do that in an agency like DHS.
What are the tools, Sydney, inside OPM that can help people like Jeff for that 6 month to year from now worldview, instead of just being so laser focused on what's happening right now?
Data. Data and data scientists, analysts who can take a look at the gap between the skills that we currently have on board and the skills we are going to need. So getting away from sort of butts and seats kinds of approaches and focusing more on what competencies does it require to deliver results, and how do we get the right people in place. Jeff mentioned Border Patrol officers. That's a really great example, and I just want to point out that yes, we need to think about 9 months from now, but today I am worried about the people who got that email, who are sitting in mission critical occupations and who are now confused and concerned. And what are we doing to ensure that they have a sense of well-being and resilience? So, that's something that we work with a lot of organizations to measure, monitor, and help employees get through these really turbulent periods.
Sydney, Jeff, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks very much for your insight.
Glad to be here.
You can read more about all the EOs and all the other policies about the federal workforce on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, canceled contracts and do not pay lists. The landscape for contractors gets cloudy across the federal government. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. Be back in a moment.
How can government agencies accelerate Gen AI adoption through smarter procurement? Find out in Speed to Mission, a must-watch television special presented by AWS Marketplace, featuring top experts from government and industry. Discover how AI is streamlining operations, enhancing security, and transforming federal technology acquisition. Now available on demand. Watch anytime at speedtomission.com.
Welcome back. The stop work order at the U.S. Agency for International Development has already impacted some former vendors to the agency. Contractors say they're unsure what happens if the orders spread to other agencies. David Berteau is president and CEO of the Professional Services Council. He's former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Materiel Readiness at DoD. Jerry McGinn is Executive Director of the Baroni Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. He's former Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me today. Dave, I start with you. The reason that I use the word former vendors at USAID is some of them are already out of business because of the stop work orders. What are people telling you in the vendor community about what they're seeing and what they're hearing, what they're worried about across the government today?
Francis, thanks for having me on. And there's really three dynamics that are working together here. One is the stop work orders for existing contracts, and I'll come back to what that really means. The second is the uncertainty about whether or not those contracts will turn into lifting the stop work order and going back to work, or a contract termination, which is a different dynamic than a stop work order. The third, and the most insidious and the less visible, is there are a bunch of invoices from prior work on those contracts before the stop work order was issued, completely in compliance with what the contract required companies to do. Those invoices have been submitted, the expenses have been paid, but they're not being reimbursed by the government. That's what's putting a lot of these companies at the thin edge of survival, because you've spent the money, you've paid the people, now you've got a stop work order because you can't get any more money, although you have to keep the people on the payroll because you may need to start up again at some point. It's a triple whammy for those companies. In addition, they may have a line of credit with a financial institution. Well, they're reading the same executive orders and then watching the same news shows that you and I are, and those banks are saying, I'm not sure you're the same credit risk you were when we put this in. So it's a triple whammy in place. We do have companies that are going out of business.
Jerry, welcome, and it's great to have you on the program. You hosted an event at the Baroni Center recently about what contracting looks like in the era of DOGE. What's your takeaway from both what you contributed and what your other thought leaders contributed at that event?
Yeah, no, it's great to be back with you, Francis. Thanks very much. That event, really, we got a lot of feedback from participants around the issue of, there's so much uncertainty that the DOGE is really about kind of the how it was established through executive order to actually help spend technology and IT spend better, is what the executive order was about. And that, there's a reason why that is. $85 billion of our federal spend is on IT broadly, and that's the largest category of spend. So there's a lot of money, a lot of room for efficiencies. However, DOGE, all the headlines have been on the things that David has been talking about, the impact on workers, which has been significant. Lots of companies are unsure kind of where they're going and where the government is going. And there's also a lot of turbulence inside of government as well. What
does that potentially mean for an area like the Defense Industrial Base as you worked with when you were inside the building?
Yeah, well, I think, if things continue at the current pace, we're going to dramatically shrink the companies that are under contract, and it's hard to see that being sustainable in any kind of way, because the government agencies can't function. But there's a lot of turbulence now. The question is kind of, what does the steady state look like, and then how do you? Because DOGE is actually about not only kind of tearing down or finding efficiencies, but it's about modernizing. There's a big software modernization initiative. What does that mean? Okay, how do you? And so there will be opportunities for companies to do things, but it's hard to see that right now.
The challenge, I guess, Dave, is that Jerry used a word that you've told me many times is anathema to the contracting community, and that's uncertainty.
Uncertainty, yeah, absolutely. Look at it, Francis. We're in a very unique transition from a government perspective, right? This is my 8th transition in Washington from one president to the next, but it's very different than any other. Why? Because President Trump was in office for 4 years, then left office for 4 years, then came back. You're seeing this across the board. Great preparation for what did we do last time? How did it turn out? Where did we succeed? Where did we fail? A lot of that interregnum of those 4 years spent getting ready for this one. So there's 3 big focuses there, and this is where I think the uncertainty comes in. Focus 1 is we got to cut. We got to cut people, we got to cut dollars, we got to cut programs. We want to do that in a way that is in alignment with the priorities, gets rid of the things that are not in alignment with the priorities. But now the second uncertainty is, what are the priorities and how do we keep in line with it? And even more importantly, when you get to implementing those priorities, you're going to need the competency and the capability and the capacity of the contractors to be able to help you move forward in that regard. So at the same time as you're tearing down a system, you have to maintain and sustain it as well. Paying the invoices is one of those pieces. It's over $700 million of unpaid invoices of money already spent. Maintaining the viability of the companies so that they can bid, win, and perform that work. And having a system in place that ties all those three together. Any one of those uncertainties is big enough. Add all three of them together, a lot of big question marks.
Jerry, you alluded to something a moment ago that I think is getting lost in the shuffle, and that is eventually, at some point, some of the things that are being torn down have to be rebuilt. There will be opportunities here also. This is not all terrible. Some people think some of it is, but not all of it.
Right.
What does that look like, and how do you advise companies to think about preparing for that time, being ready to leverage whatever those opportunities become?
Well, part of it lies in how DOGE was established, because prior to the inauguration, there was a big thought it was going to be an outside commission, a blue ribbon panel. That's not what the president did. He signed an executive order which created DOGE as part of the executive office of the president. It essentially took over what's called the U.S. Digital Service. And why is that important? So the U.S. Digital Service was stood up as a result of a little thing called healthcare.gov. Back in the kind of the prior administration, which was really kind of an IT and a website disaster. And so the idea was of the digital service was to bring in Silicon Valley, bring in commercial kind of software experts for short-term kind of stints to help advise agencies on how to be more efficient, more effective. So it's a natural place, actually home for DOGE, at least that it's chartered under to build efficiencies under the executive order. So eventually, as we were discussing, they're going to have to do some kind of build some and do the software modernization initiative. What does that look like? Is there a role for AI in acquisition? I think there's a lot of that. Are they going to look at things like types of contracts? The value of things is very different from today than it was in the 1950s when we set up the special cost accounting standard for cost plus contracts. Do we need that? Do we need things like the Truth in Negotiation Act that has lots of costs for companies and for government? So looking at those are ways that you can start to get after some of these efficiencies in time. But that's not happening now, but that's where I see sort of the next kind of wave on rebuilding kind of some of these efforts.
Dave, we have about a minute left. How does one look at potentially leveraging whatever opportunities exist in light of what DOGE decides it wants to do at some point?
Well, there are areas of the government we know contracts are going out and new work is being done. Defense, obviously, is a piece of it. All of the border security, and Congress is marking up this past week the Reconciliation Act for FY25 to increase border funding, et cetera. So there will be work there to be done. The best thing for a company to do is, how do I align my resources that I have, the people, the technology, the systems and processes in place, put those resources to focus on what the government needs going forward. There's a real interesting element of this in that typically we know what the government's going to be spending money on because they've submitted a budget to Congress. Congress is marking it up. Eventually the money's going to turn into contracts. Right now, that front end is an additional layer of uncertainty on top of that. We'll probably have to cover that in another show, though.
You always take me back to the budget, Dave, and I appreciate that. It's great to have both of you on the show. Thanks very much for joining me. You can read more about the acquisition landscape right now on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, a warning for the IRS as tax season opens. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment.
We've seen that really three main use cases seem to pop up as being really easily impacted by generative AI. And those are application modernization, client experience, and digital labor.
Welcome back. The 2024 tax filing season is underway at the Internal Revenue Service. The agency says it'll make progress again this year on some of the timeliness problems it's faced in the past. Jessica Lucas-Judy is Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Jessica, welcome. Thanks for coming on the program today. You're looking at this very issue for the IRS. How are they doing at getting to the goals that they've set out in closing that loop on getting returns finished and completed as quickly as they can?
Sure. So just first of all, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, the tax filing season is when most people interact with the IRS, and it's usually the last weekend in January until about mid-April. Tax day typically is the 15th, but sometimes it's not. And so our report was on the 2024 tax filing season, so people filing their returns for 2023, so think back about a year. And what we found was that IRS had been making progress in correcting overcoming some of the challenges that it had faced in the past with timeliness. And of the tax returns that it received last year during that filing season, it was able to process about 98% of them timely. But it continues to have problems with paper, and this has been, the taxpayer advocate and others have reported on this before. IRS had set a goal for itself of filing or processing those returns and making payments in 13 days, and they were averaging 20. And of course, there was some variation there. So, as I said, this has been a problem before, and in our prior year's report, we had recommended that IRS analyze the reasons behind the challenges that it was facing, what was causing some of those difficulties in processing, and take steps or have a plan in place to be able to address them. And IRS did make some changes. They made some changes primarily in how they actually calculate that timeliness, but they still haven't documented what the challenges were. And so this is something that we're going to, now that we're in 2025, we're starting our look at the 2025 tax filing season. So we're going to be continuing to follow up to find out what kind of progress the agency is able to make.
What's the trend line look like? 20 days as opposed to 13 days sounds like, well, they're getting close, but is that gap coming down? Is that gap getting bigger? What does that look like?
For the most part, yeah, the improvements that I was talking about, so particularly when it comes to electronic filing, most people, that's how they file, whether it's through software or a tax preparer, or now with the new direct file service or with Free File, people submit their returns, and within just a few days, usually their return is processed. They either their payment is processed or they get a refund. But it's really the paper that's been the challenge, and that was a problem even before the pandemic. But as you probably recall, the mail stopped. You had people who were not able to work in person for a period of time, and so those returns just piled up. And it's taken the agency a number of years to be able to get beyond that and to start reducing that backlog.
You write about some items in here where the IRS has done some forward-facing things to try to let folks know what's going on, but I keep detecting a kind of yes but throughout these. Here's one. In March 2024, IRS launched a webpage showing the receipt date of correspondence that IRS is currently processing. And here's the but. The web page doesn't provide information estimating how long taxpayers can expect to wait for a response once processing begins. Is that something that's knowable within the scope of what the IRS does, and they're just not providing it or not able to provide it, or is that something that's difficult for them to get their arms around?
I will say actually both, right? So it's going to be complicated, and obviously they can't give information specific to every specific taxpayer. That's just A, not possible, and B, it would have all kinds of privacy issues, right? But you can probably project on average sort of what the things might be. And so I went and actually looked before this interview. I went and looked to see what's on the website now, and for example, on individual affidavits for identity theft. IRS is currently processing affidavits that it received in I believe it's October 2023. So that's fine if you filed in 2023 or later, right? You can say, okay, it's not just me. It's not my problem. I'll just wait. Right. But if you filed earlier than that, then you start wondering, oh gosh, okay, did they get it? So then maybe you send in a letter, or maybe you send your affidavit in again, or you call and you say, hey, what's going on? So all those things then are adding to the volume of paper, the volume of calls that are coming in, and are just sort of exacerbating the problem. So we think it's important, that communication, and we'd recommend it that they better communicate, the status to taxpayers to sort of calm that down a little bit.
And that's where I wanted to go next. What helps solve these issues? What are some of the recommendations you make to solve some of these issues? And what will you watch? You talked a little bit about what you're going to watch in 2025 in the current tax season, and I would love to know more about that too.
Sure. So some of the things have been hiring. IRS has had persistent difficulty in hiring and retaining employees. There's always a surge that goes on, bringing in temporary hires and seasonal hires to deal with the filing season. But sort of long term, it's the same people who are answering the phones as are processing the correspondence, the amended returns and notices and things like that. And so when IRS improves its phone service, then historically the correspondence has suffered, and there's been a backlog. And so we've recommended that they work on that. And so we're looking too at the retention and has improved. IRS was able to use Inflation Reduction Act funds as well as its own appropriations and some user fees to bring additional staff on. So we'll be very interested to see how they're able to sustain that moving forward, and deal with in-person service. That's another thing that IRS had made improvements. This past year in 2024, they were able to do things like expanded hours for people who can't get in, during the normal hours of 8:30 to 4:30 on weekdays. So they had Saturday hours, they had some evening hours, and so they've been expanding that kind of service. But we had recommended previously that you have a strategy for your in-person service, and you have a strategy for online services and mobile service and web services and things like that. We really think those should be integrated. Should have them sort of speak to each other. So as you're making improvements in digital services, what kind of effect is that going to have on the needs of taxpayers for in-person services, and trying to integrate those. And so that's another recommendation that we'll be continuing to follow up on.
Jessica, it's great to have you back in the program. Thanks for joining me.
It's wonderful to be here.
You can read more about the IRS's prep for filing season on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Fed Gov Today continues in just a moment.
How can government agencies accelerate Gen AI adoption through smarter procurement? Find out in Speed to Mission, a must-watch television special presented by AWS Marketplace, featuring top experts from government and industry. Discover how AI is streamlining operations, enhancing security, and transforming federal technology acquisition. Now available on demand. Watch anytime at speedtomission.com.
Welcome back to Fed Gov Today podcast. This week features the chair of the Chief Data Officers Council, Kirsten Dalbo, with a look at the health and the future of the CDO community in the federal government. You can listen to the Fed Gov Today podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your shows. Fed Gov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10:30 with the acting Chief Technology Officer at the Navy, Justin Finelli. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.